Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister believe that the current lobbying rules are fit for purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I join the right honourable gentleman in what he said about Ian Gibson, and I indeed share the widespread concern about some of the stuff that we're reading at the moment, Mr. Speaker, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary shares my concern as well. I do think it is a good idea in principle that top civil servants should be able to engage with business and should have experience of the private sector. When I look at the accounts I'm reading today, it's not clear that those boundaries have been properly understood, and I've asked for a proper independent review of the arrangements that we have to be conducted by Nigel Boardman, and he will be reporting in June. And if he has any representations he wishes to make on that subject, he should do so to Mr. Boardman.
Stop.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is launching an inquiry. That inquiry isn't even looking at the lobbying rules. I'm not sure it's looking at very much at all, because every day there's further evidence of the sleaze that's now at the heart of this Conservative government. Let's just look, shake your heads, let's just look at the latest scandal. A wealthy businessman, Lex Greensill, was hired as a senior advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. We've all seen the business card. After he left office, Cameron, became a paid lobbyist for Lex Greensill. Next thing we know, Cameron arranged access for Greensill with cabinet ministers and senior officials, and he lobbied for taxpayers' money on behalf of Greensill Capital. We also know the Chancellor pushed officials. We know the Health Secretary met Cameron and Greensill. We know that senior officials met Greensill Capital regularly. And now, even more unbelievably, we know the government's former head of procurement, no less, became a Greensill advisor while he was still a civil servant. Does the Prime Minister accept there's a revolving door, indeed an open door, between his Conservative government and paid lobbyists?
Mr. Speaker, this is a government and a party that has been consistently tough on lobbying, and indeed we introduced legislation saying that there should be no taxpayer-funded lobbying, that quangos should not be used to get involved with lobbying. We put in a register for lobbyists, and there's one party, Mr. Speaker, that actually voted to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act, and that was the Labour Party in their historic 2019 election manifesto, which he has yet to repudiate, Mr. Speaker. They did so because they thought it was unfair and was restricting people's ability to make representations to politicians. I think that's absurd. Will he now say that it's absurd to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act?
Mr. Speaker, he talks of the Lobbying Act. Who was it who introduced that legislation? David Cameron. Who was it who voted for the legislation? Half the Conservative front bench. We said it wouldn't be tough enough. And where did that legislation lead? 2 years later, David Cameron camping out in a Saudi desert with Lex Greensill having a cup of tea. I rest my case in relation to that legislation. Let me try another very simple question. Is the Prime Minister aware of any other government official who had commercial links with Greensill or any other lobbying role while working in government?
Mr. Speaker, if he has any such information, he should, of course, make it available to Mr. Boardman. That's the point of his. That's the point of his review. It's an independent review. It'll be coming to me by June. I'll be glad it will be played in the library of the House of Commons. We'll talk about lobbying, Mr. Speaker. He's being advised by Lord Mandelson of Global Counsel Limited. Perhaps in the interests of full transparency, so we can know where he's coming from, Lord Mandelson could be encouraged to disclose his other clients, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard a defence that ridiculous since my last days in the Crown Court. It's called the shoplifter's defence. Everyone else is nicking stuff, so why can't I? Mr. Speaker, it never worked. I remind the Prime Minister, I not only prosecuted shoplifters, I prosecuted MPs over the MPs' expenses scandal. So I stand on my record. That line just isn't going to wash with me. It was a former Prime Minister, and I suspect now a former lobbyist, who once said, "This isn't a minor issue with minor consequences. Government contracts potentially worth hundreds of billions of pounds are at stake." So can the Prime Minister now answer the question the Chancellor's been ducking for weeks? How was it that Greensill Capital, a company employing David Cameron, got the green light to give hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayer-backed loans?
Mr. Speaker, whilst he was prosecuting MPs, I was cutting crime in London by 23% and cutting the murder rate by 50%. And he asks about lobbying on behalf of Greensill. Mr. Speaker, and again, I don't wish to embarrass the right honourable gentleman, but he doesn't have far to look. There was one person asking for the Greensill Bank to be able to use the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, and that was the Shadow Defence Secretary, Mr. Speaker.
It gets weaker and weaker. It does take me back to my defence days in the Crown Court. It's just ridiculous. The Shadow Defence Secretary. It really wasn't a good point. If you think that's a good point, you've got real problems. Shadow Defence Secretary was speaking for his constituents and for local jobs. That is million miles away from being a paid lobbyist texting friends in government. The Prime Minister says there's going to be an inquiry, but the person he's appointed worked for the same law firm which lobbied to loosen lobbying laws. You couldn't make it up. What we need is to overhaul the whole broken system. This afternoon, Labour's motion calls for a proper parliamentary inquiry into this scandal. If the Prime Minister is so concerned about this, he should welcome the motion. After all, to quote David Cameron, his old school friend, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So will the Prime Minister vote with Labour today for a full, transparent, independent inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, I think he would have been better off supporting the Lobbying Act, and the Labour Party would have been better off not campaigning to get rid of it. It toughens up our laws, and Mr. Speaker, I think that his own proposal is simply to have, yet again, to have politicians marking their own homework. What the country wants, that's all it is. A committee of MPs to look at it. It won't do a blind bit of good. That's why we're having a proper independent review. If he has any representations or allegations to make about what has taken place, he should make them to the eminent lawyer who's been asked to do it and will be reporting to us by June.
Sir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should be voting with us, not blocking a proper inquiry. The Greensill scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Dodgy contracts, privileged access, jobs for their mates. This is the return of Tory sleaze. Mr. Speaker, it's now so ingrained in this Conservative government, we don't need another Conservative Party appointee marking their own homework. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the more I listen to the Prime Minister, the more I think that Ted Hastings and AC12 are needed to get to the bottom of this one. Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister will not act against sleaze, but this House can. So can I urge all members of this House to come together this afternoon to back Labour's motion and start to clean up the sleaze and cronyism that's at the heart of this Conservative government?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's why we're putting in an independent review. That's why we have tougher laws on lobbying. A great shame that Labour opposed them. Mr. Speaker, yes, we are getting on with rooting out bent coppers, Mr. Speaker. We're also appointing and hiring thousands more police officers, Mr. Speaker. We're fighting crime. We're fighting crime on the streets of our cities, whilst they opposed the police and crime bill, which would have put in tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. Absolutely. And they then encouraged people who went out and demonstrated decided, Mr. Speaker, to kill the bill. We're getting on with protecting the public. That's absolutely correct, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with protecting the public of this country from crime of all kinds. We're getting on with the job of running this country, of rolling out a vaccination programme.
Order.